everybody. Thank you so much for coming out. I'm Jennifer Pitts from the Political Science Department and the Committee on Social Thought, and on behalf of 3CT, I am thrilled to be moderating this conversation about Robert Gooding Williams's remarkable new book, Democracy and Beauty, The Political Aesthetics of W.E.B. Du Bois. Bob is a very dear friend and a dearly missed former colleague to me and many of us here, and we are thrilled to have him here for this conversation. He's also one of the greatest contemporary interpreters of Du Bois's philosophy and political thought and its resonances for later thinkers and for our own time, going back to his magisterial book In the Shadow of Du Bois, Afro-Modern Political Thought in America of 2009, and to his edition of Du Bois's Souls of Black Folk, through which Du Bois's thought is made available every year to many students at the University of Chicago, including a number of course sequences. It's a very special pleasure and privilege to welcome him back to the university to discuss his latest book. Robert Gooding Williams is the Brooks and Suzanne Reagan Professor of Philosophy at Yale University, where, as a product of both Yale College and the graduate school, he was awarded the 2023 Wilbur Cross Medal, a recognition of exceptional achievement by Yale alumni. He was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 2018, and he was the recipient of a 2020 Guggenheim Fellowship, during which he wrote some of the key moments in Democracy and Beauty. His interest in aesthetics runs throughout his work, including in two of his earlier books, Zarathustra's Dionysian Modernism from 2001, and Look, a Negro, Philosophical Essays on Race, Culture, and Politics of 2005. Democracy and Beauty, published by Columbia University Press and available for sale through the Seminary Co-op at the end of this event, was developed in lectures, including a memorable keynote address that some of us heard at the American Political Science Association, as well as the 2022 Leonard Hastings Schaff Memorial Lectures at Columbia University. At the core of the book is an exposition of two fundamental claims in the political aesthetics of Du Bois's masterpiece, Darkwater. These claims are that artistic beauty and natural beauty can both, in different ways and with different audiences, aid in the fight against white supremacy and the political formation that Du Bois called democratic despotism. Artistic beauty does this by challenging and expanding the moral horizons of white participants in racial domination, and natural beauty does this by persuading those whose demoralizing struggle against white supremacy has rendered them pessimists who are ready to give up. Persuading them that the world is more open to their action than they realize. The book pursues many other rich themes, including the contrast between the crowd and the mob, in which what characterizes the crowd is its receptivity to new forms of knowledge, a contrast that recurs at unexpected and illuminating moments throughout the book. Democracy and Beauty lives up to its title in ways that Bob perhaps didn't explicitly mean, in that it in itself is a truly beautifully written work, and written in the spirit of openness to the new and unfamiliar that he argues is characteristic of democracy as Du Bois understood it. Some of Du Bois's aesthetic arguments are, to me, not just unfamiliar, but indeed rather baffling, and it's an achievement of the book, one familiar to those of us who've been learning from Bob for many years, that it takes the reader in hand with such patience and generosity in its exploration of Du Bois's thought, and especially of the great and complex work that is Darkwater. Given the breadth of the book's subject, we wanted to have an interdisciplinary conversation about it. Our discussants are Adrienne Brown and Adom Getachew. I think Adom will go first. Adrienne Brown is professor in the departments of English and Race, Diaspora, and Indigeneity. Her books include The Black Skyscraper, Architecture and the Perception of Race, and The Residential is Racial, A Perceptual History of Mass Homeownership, published in 2024. Her many articles include one that I want to highlight for its relevance to our conversation today, and that is her publication in PMLA of Du Bois's unpublished story, The Princess Steel, with an accompanying discussion in which she takes up Du Bois's account of art as propaganda and the relation between his social and political theory and his fiction. So I'm very excited to hear Adrienne's thoughts. And Adom Getachew is professor of race, diaspora, and indigeneity and political science. She's the author of World Making After Empire, The Rise and Fall of Self-Determination, and is currently working on a book about the intellectual origins and political practices of Garveyism. She too is a wonderful interpreter of Du Bois, as I know well from working with her on an edition of Du Bois's international writings published in 2022 and related articles. So I will turn it over to Adom first, and then she and Adrienne will raise some questions and points of discussion. Bob will respond to those and work in to his responses to their comments, anything else that he wants to get on the table for the conversation, and then we'll open it to the audience.
Great. All right, good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for joining us, and thanks especially to Bob for writing such an amazing book and for giving us this occasion for a conversation. Adrienne and I have been circling around Du Bois in various ways, but I think this is actually the first time we've had such a panel or such a conversation, so thank you for that. But I've been in conversation with Bob around Du Bois's World War I and post-war writings really since 2019, when Jennifer and I first began working on our edition of Du Bois's international writings. Both in that project we engaged in together, and in so many of my other projects, I've learned so much from Bob's careful distillation of Du Bois's thought. In Democracy and Beauty, he brings his, very analytic precision to the study of Dark Water, a relatively neglected text, I think, in especially political theory and political philosophy, where the Souls of Black Folk has become, such a canonized text, but very rarely are his kind of intellectual and political development after 1903 taken up. So in Democracy and Beauty, and really Jennifer already said this, it feels like you're sitting in a seminar room in the best sense of that word. You're walked through, you're presented part of the text that you thought you knew so well, and then it's read for you in an entirely different way, and it just really opens up a variety of vantage points, even for someone who's taught Dark Water, who had a kind of perspective on what the book was about. I think it's a wonderful testament to the clarity, precision, patience that Bob brings to his reading of Du Bois. At the same time, this book opens up, I think, some very interesting conversations with contemporary Black studies. So there's a number of ways that Bob is bringing Du Bois in conversation with figures like Saidiya Hartman or Frank Wilderson, but also contemporary Black artists. And it's really the openness and it's an invitation, I think, for us to continue to think about the uses, the legacies of Du Bois's thinking on political aesthetics that I think is really fruitful about this text. So there's many, many things I think we could say about the significant interventions this book makes. I think what I find really productive about it is that it really helps us to focus on what Du Bois himself called his second phase, his new thinking about what white supremacy entailed. And in doing so, it makes more visible for us, I think, the ways that in particular democracy becomes an increasingly central preoccupation for Du Bois, beginning with these World War I writings and then obviously continuing on into kind of the other magisterial work he would do after this Black Reconstruction. And related to that centering of democracy, it opens up anew, I think, questions of the economy, of imperialism, and of course, centrally for Bob, aesthetics. So what I want to do is just ask three very broad questions. They'll have like sub-questions under them, but there'll be three overall. The first really has to do with how we mark the departures and continuities in Du Bois's thought from Souls of Black Folk, which was the subject of Bob's 2009 book, In the Shadow of Du Bois, to Dark Water. So one, of course, as I've already suggested, is that Du Bois himself marks his own transition by saying, he had conceived of white supremacy as a problem of ignorance in his first phase, and then in the second phase, he understands it to be a problem of ignorance and ill will. And then the aesthetic education that he's distilling is a response to this problem of ill will. So it seems to me that there's another kind of transformation that he does not himself explicitly thematize, and it's what I suggested earlier, which is that democracy becomes much more of the central focal point. So of his writing and thinking about white supremacy. So the question here is, in some ways, what propels that increasing interest in the question of democracy? Why or how does this formulation of white supremacy as a combination of ignorance and ill will necessitate or coincide with an interest in the question of democracy? So that's to ask again about difference and departures. But to focus more on continuity, I was struck here by the ways the crowd emerges as the central modality or mode form in which the question of democracy appears, and it's formulated in the book. The openness of the democratic crowd is contrasted with the mob. So I was curious about how these categories of formulating collective assembly relate to the ones you had highlighted in your reading of Souls of Black Folk. And there, the two that emerged are the masses and the folk. So one, it seems that the crowd, as you show, Du Bois understands the crowd to be a trained crowd, that there's this kind of language of training, and the aesthetic education, of course, that you're reconstructing for us is part of that training. So I wonder who does the training, right? In Souls, there's a very specific way in which a Black elite, a Black leadership is central to the politics of training the masses. In the World War I writings, there's some moments in which Du Bois suggests that the democracy is about self-training or self-education. But yeah, I just wonder, who does the training? Is the aesthetic education a self-education, or does it require a kind of elite? So that's to ask about the training that might connect Souls with Dark Water. And then another space of continuity might be the ways that what you described in The Shadow of Du Bois as his politics of expressivism continues to persist or animates his aesthetics even in this moment. So Bob tells us that Du Bois's conception of beauty commits him to a democratic pluralism, and precisely the aspiration is that an encounter and engagement with both artistic and natural beauty opens us up to the unexpected, and that the openness to the unexpected is a key marker of the democratic crowd. But Bob also notes that Du Bois himself falls short of this commitment in his responses to the literature of the period. So his reviews, Bob focuses in particular on his reviews of Claude McKay and Nella Larson, and also on his in his rendering of Black women as types in the Damnation of Women essay. So in both of these, Du Bois seems to open up a commitment to democratic pluralism, but nevertheless closes up and especially in his conception of Black women, treat them as kind of types. So I wonder if this kind of typing is about the persistence of his expressivist aesthetics. The idea being that these types are meant to represent or model the folk, the Black folk in particular, and in maybe just a question or a wondering about the particular role that women play vis-a-vis a representation of the folk. So I think your reading of The Damnation of Women really coincides with what others have written about vis-a-vis his 1915 pageant, A Star of Ethiopia, where there's a similar kind of parading of a series of women that play these kind of iconic roles and move the story of the race forward in time. I mean, I guess the folk and the expressivism associated with the folk may also shape and inform Du Bois's renderings of the beautiful life. And here your example is Alexander Crummell, and there's as the life that kind of realizes itself fully, comes to an end in such a way that fulfills itself. And I wonder, again, given that Crummell is such a central part of your reading of his expressivism in The Souls of Black Folk, whether there's something about expressivism, a commitment to the beautiful life that comes to an end, being part of this commitment to an expressivist aesthetics. So that was all one. That was the longest one. So The second will be shorter, I promise. So the second is
Oh, that was all what?
that was one.
Oh, I had.
Continuity and discontinuity.
All right.
souls and-
Oh, great.
okay.
Great.
The second is just about the ideals and practices and habits of mind. So I'm very persuaded by the view that the white supremacist isn't living in that Du Bois is right when he says it's not a mere contradiction of like, okay, we hold these democratic ideals, but we're somehow white supremacists in practice. So the argument here is that the charge of hypocrisy is in some ways insufficient to calling out this, as a critique of white supremacy. There's no contradiction really between ideals and practices. But I just wonder what we should then make with I think many moments that Du Bois does appear to mobilize a charge of hypocrisy. So one thing we could say about them is like these are strategic, right? So one instance of this in the World War I writings is a letter he writes to Woodrow Wilson, and he's basically like, you say you're fighting a war for democracy abroad, but here you are, not entrenching and reinforcing Jim Crow at home. And some of this language also shows up in the Souls of White Folk essay in Dark Water and elsewhere in Dark Water as well. I think the other thought might be that hypocrisy is somehow constitutive of the argument about habits of mind, and that could go something like this. And this thought comes from just a sense that I've always found really striking in Du Bois, especially in the essay of Souls of White Folk, his insistence that the discovery of personal whiteness is a new thing, that the religion of white supremacy, he's very interested in historicizing it and historicizing it to a relatively recent date, right? So I wonder, and he says in the openings of that essay that what this new religion does is it dampens our generous enthusiasm for what we once counted as glorious. So that really what he's diagnosing is a gradual transformation of ideals over time, and that habit or habituation is a way for him to talk about how living in the gap between ideals and practice over time transforms those ideals. And I think this may be important because it seems like in order for the appeal of artistic beauty to work, there has to be some shared sense of some shared language of what the ideals are. And we can say more about this, but in your reading of the Jesus Christ in Texas story, it seems important that the woman who witnesses what she takes to be the crucifixion of Christ understands herself to have some commitment to Christian brotherhood or the suffering of Christ as a model for humanity. So something about those ideals seem like they have to be there in order to be recuperated or reactivated. So that's the second question. And then the third, and I know Adrienne will have much more to say about aesthetics, but I was surprised by the disaggregation between artistic and natural beauty. So I can understand that, say, the Montego sunset, Bay Sunset, or the Grand Canyon, would be insufficient. They can't challenge the white supremacists in the way that the story does, the story of Jesus Christ in Texas. But I guess these categories seem more overlapping than at least in the presentation. So one side of overlap might be what he describes as what Du Bois takes to be exemplars of natural beauty. And he describes the glory of sea, sky, and city as that which can, thwart the world's ugliness. So I think it's just really striking that the man-made city appears alongside the sky and sea as possible sources of this kind of beauty. The second, and as you describe it, is that the perception of natural beauty involves both a process that you call at once creative and disclosive. right? So I just wonder, is what matters then really the cultivation of a creative and imaginative perception, one which you might apply as much to the Montego Bay sunset as you might to, the urban conditions what you find yourself in. Yeah, so I think those are my questions.
Adrienne, do you wanna
No, I mean, yes, I have questions, but I'm gonna.
let Bob
That's a lot,
respond?
yeah.
Okay.
Oh, you want me,
Whatever you would like, if you would like
Oh.
to hear all of them and then.
Yeah.
maybe hear all of them, because it
boy.
might be that maybe there are overlaps or intersections.
Okay.
And I know when I'm a member of the audience, I like to do it the way I'm suggesting. Just
Okay.
have,
All
you
right.
know,
Cool.
I don't know, having it punctuated, I think is, again, I won't like give a long speech as to why this is the right way to do, why I think this is the best way to do things, but let me just.
I trust you. And it's also a testament to you, I think, and that you can hold all of this in mind. So I'm once more in awe. Darkwater is my favorite Du Bois text. To me, it's where Du Bois feels, I guess one way to describe it is just free, right? He's funny, even though he says he's humorless. It's filled with his kind of droll humor. The imagery is so broad. There's just so much in Darkwater. He's taking so many formal chances. He's trying out so many ideas, and I find it an electric text, and it becomes even more electric, I think, in your conversation with Du Bois and your thinking with Du Bois in your text. As a literary critic, I've thought a lot about Du Bois as an artist and thought a lot about his relationship to art. Specifically in this period, right? He's the boogeyman, right? In the Harlem, or for a lot of Black writers, right? He's the boogeyman of a certain kind of conservatism. He would increasingly become, right, after 1919 into the 20s, right? As he's shaping the Harlem Renaissance, helping it work, put it together, making its connections, right? But also, slamming Claude McKay, right? And becomes this antagonistic figure, right? To some, if not all of, to many of the writers who are in that kind of coterie. But what I hadn't really thought about, I think this really piggybacks on your last question, right, is to think about Du Bois as an aesthetic theorist, which is different than thinking about him as an artist and thinking about him in relationship to art. So maybe to go specifically to that question, the way that you trace his approach to beauty is quite broad, because it is broad in the book, right? It encompasses things like a life well lived, a sunset, religious visions, apocryphal vision, theatrical presentation of the protest, which I love that moment in the book. That was so interesting, right? To think about Du Bois thinking about protest and assembly itself as having these aesthetic dimensions. The Du Bois that you craft for us is seemingly more interested in the aesthetic dimensions of the world rather than the idea of the artwork, right? With it, like the artwork of literature, poetry, music, or painting. Or he's not, beauty is way beyond that. And in Darkwater, he really is most interested, I think, in that broadness that you bring out in your careful attention to him, which sits, as you mark in the book, right, in some tension, right, with the way he writes about artwork, right, the McKay, the way he reads Larson's Quicksand, which is such a bizarre reading to me, right? His reading of Quicksand, right, is so strange. The way that he thinks about art and propaganda and the criteria of art, like he's cast as being so narrow, and oftentimes is narrow and kind of contradictory when he's talking about the artwork. And yet behind that, right, in the ways you kind of situate his theory of beauty as being so much bigger than the artwork, is really helpful, right? And to me, it was such an expansion of how to think about Du Bois, especially in light of his claim in the beginning of Death and Beauty to be art blind, right? There's a moment where he says, I'm humorless, I have no fun, I'm sensitive, and I'm art blind, right? So I was interested in how, hearing you talk more about that expansive version of the beautiful and its distinctiveness from his approach to the artwork, the man-made artwork, per se. I wanted to ask you also about Darkwater itself as a concept. I've often thought about dark water, itself, the idea of dark water as a kind of aesthetic and political conception, right? Like evolution in some ways of the idea of double consciousness, of a binarism in that, to this kind of more multitudinous model of collectivity and vision coming out of in the wake of both World War I and the Great Migration, right? That the mass and the folk was no longer going to work, right? In 1919, 1918, 1917, right? And that you needed a different model, right, to think about the masses, right, in line with the way you were thinking about the crowd versus the mob. And I just wanted you to talk more about the potentialities of dark water in the ways that you think about the potentialities of the crowd as it shaped Du Bois's aesthetic outlook in this period. Because when you try to track the ways that water and dark water appears across the book, right, it changes all the time, right? And one moment it's a symbol for democracy, right? Like democracy, non-white democracy, right? Another, it's the Grand Canyon, right? And another one is Jamaica, right? It's the water next to the sunset, right? And that figure of dark water, as it shifts across the book, seems to track so neatly with the ways that you're thinking about his vision of beauty as it moves across the book. So I just wanted to hear you talk about that. And maybe I'll pick one more thing. This question of arrangement, like one of the kind of amazing insights that Bob sits with and really teases out what it means is this Du Bois' insistence that beauty, for something to be beautiful, it has to have an apt conclusion or an ending, right? Which suggests that there's got to be a temporality, right? And that the ending is very important. But it also struck me that the ending is very important to Du Bois, but he's also so interested in arrangement in general, like the quality of the arrangement, like so many of the examples of beauty that you call attention to, right? There are moments where elements are differently arranged to produce that new familiarization, right? A different way of seeing it versus the call for a new kind of aesthetics, right? Or new kind of artwork or a new kind of form, right? Du Bois is constantly saying, let's take what we have and twist it, right? And give it a different shape or put them into different configurations, right? Like he does in The Prince of Steel, the comet, right? That moment, that vision, that religious vision in Jesus Christ in Texas, they're not new things, right? He's like, if you put these things together, this vision of the cross, this vision of fire, we get a different possibility. And I was interested in that idea or his commitment to thinking about calling not so much for the creation of a new aesthetic forms, right, but the rearrangement of the forms we have and the possibilities of that rearrangement. And it helped me think something about Du Bois that I've thought about a long time. I have a failed project with Britt Russer to publish all of Du Bois's short fiction. That got held up by the estate, but we read all of his short fiction, and something that comes up, obviously he's so interested in genre, right? A genre writer in his fiction, but in lots of places. He wrote all of these detective stories in the 1950s under the name Bud Weissop, which is W.B. Du Bois rearranged, right? And he tried to publish them and never got published. But to the end, right, he's writing genre fiction. And these are just like, you got on the train and the jewels got stolen kinds of genre fiction, right? They're not experimental. They are just straight up like Agatha Christie knockoffs, right? But it strikes me, given, like, again, Du Bois's commitment to the rearrangement of form, right? His dedication to form and the possibilities within it, right? Rather than calling for, a kind of radical new vision or form, as other people in that period would have been calling for, right? Or right after him, right? Which I think distinguishes him, right, from, let's say, like someone like Benjamin, right? I was thinking about when Charlie Chaplin plays a key role in Dark Water, and Bob has this great reading of that moment of Du Bois trying to go see Charlie Chaplin. So I'm just interested in that question of arrangement. Okay, that's it.
Great, thank you both very, very much. Let me say first that it's just great to be back at the University of Chicago with so many familiar faces, friends, former colleagues. Not only do I want to thank Adom and Adrienne for their comments, but I want also to thank in addition, Adom and Jennifer, Adom was kind of underplaying the significance of the conversation I had with her and with Jennifer about, especially, but this hasn't come up in the conversation today, but there is a chapter in the book on democratic, Du Bois's conception of democratic despotism as he develops it in a 1915 essay, the title of which I'm now
African Roots of War.
African Roots of War. And it's a very interesting essay because it involves if you read carefully, a kind of engagement with contemporary theories of imperialism, arguably Hobson, Luxemburg, Hilferding, Lenin, and before all of them, Engels, Du Bois develops a notion of labor aristocracy. And I think that chapter went through, several drafts. Jennifer was kind enough to share some of her own work on Hobson, and conversations via email and in person with both Jennifer and Adom helped me, craft that chapter to a point of getting it, finally I thought kind of getting things, right, or at least, sufficiently right to, overcome their objections. So, or so I thought. Maybe we'll hear more. But okay, so let me move to the various comments. First on the question, I suppose first on the question of democracy. I didn't divide your comments into three parts. I was just going A, B, C, D, E. So my organization in my notes is a little different than yours, but I will try to touch on most of what you had to say, Adom. I think that Du Bois, when he's writing Darkwater, I argue, he almost has a theory of democracy, and it has three components. There's a historical component that relates to this notion of democratic despotism, and it concerns the question: why is, as it were, democracy? Why is it that democracy, as Du Bois understands it, advancing among the white working class in Europe and America, but not, among the world's peoples of color? And Du Bois has a kind of answer to that that has to do with the kind of conflict between, on the one hand, capitalism and democratic ideals stemming from the French Revolution, and again, having to do with this idea of a labor aristocracy and the way in which the white working class aligns itself with capital in order to advance imperialist interests from which it benefits. So that's like one part of the larger theory. You might think of that as the kind of descriptive explanatory dimension of the theory. Du Bois also has a normative conception of democracy, what philosophers would call kind of epistemic democracy. At some point along the way, I kind of relate Du Bois's view to some of Elizabeth Anderson's writings. But there are other philosophers who have talked about, epistemic democracy. There's broadly speaking, kind of Deweyan, element here. I'm not suggesting that Du Bois got this from Dewey, but Deweyans like Anderson, if you read them, what they're doing with kind of Dewey-inspired conception of democracy today, you can see affinities between what they're doing, what Du Bois is doing at the time that he wrote Darkwater. So there is a kind of conception of democracy as a universal enfranchisement, in particular as a normative ideal, and as an ideal that I think continues to animate Du Bois's thought in Black Reconstruction. I think there are lots of interesting overlooked affinities between the argumentation, normative and otherwise, of Black Reconstruction and that of Darkwater. And then there's the cultural element, and the cultural element has to do with what kind. And again, comparison to Dewey is relevant here. What kind of culture is necessary in order to, as a foster and sustain a democratic form of life, and that's where the distinction between the mob and the crowd comes into play. Now, maybe that's maybe thinking about that distinction in connection to you know, what Adom had to say about possible, well, you raised this, you raised some questions about how I'm thinking about the mob and the crowd distinction, you know, in Darkwater. How am I thinking about that, you know, vis-a-vis, you know, in relation to a contrast to possibly the distinction between the mass and the folk in Souls of Black Folks. So, or at least my interpretation of Souls of Black Folks. So, for those who don't know, I think that, you know, I argue that in order to understand the argumentation of the Souls of Black Folk, you have to kind of see that Du Bois talks about Black people, you know, sometimes as mass, sometimes as folk. When he talks about them as a mass, they're a kind of, you know, aggregate of backward, you know, individuals, you know, thrown into the modern world who, you know, have lost their bearing and kind of, you know, need to learn the art of social organization and so forth and so on. They need to be uplifted, you know, by a talented tent. But then there's a question of legitimacy and efficacy, and just to stick with the issue of legitimacy, you know, how does Du Bois thinking about legitimacy? And I kind of argue that there's a notion of, you know, charisma. I mean, I'm thinking, you know, broadly speaking in Weberian terms here, but the charisma and Du Bois is not just talking about legitimacy. On my argument, Du Bois is not just talking about the, you know, he's talking about legitimacy, not just in a de facto sense, but in a de jure sense. So I think what he thinks that Black leaders legitimate precisely to, this is at least my reading of Souls of Black Folk, precisely to the extent that their leadership, you know, manifests a charisma that expresses, you know, the ethos, the spirit of the black folk. It's interesting. So so first coming back to Adom's concerns, I hadn't really thought about the two category, the two distinctions in relationship to each other, and I just have to think about that more. I mean, the one distinction relates to, you know, how Du Bois is thinking about Black people in the Souls of Black folk. The other relates to how Du Bois is thinking about his fellow white citizens, not in principle, but in terms of the application of the category. And so part of the idea of an aesthetic education, and this connection, you know, I kind of, at the end of the introduction, I kind of try to position Du Bois vis-a-vis Schiller and Schiller's famous book on the aesthetic education of man. But the idea, broadly speaking, of aesthetic education is to foster, you know, in the long run, a culture of the crowd, which is a culture characterized by openness and receptivity to difference, whereas, you know, the culture of the mob wants to, as it were, shut that down, and the mob is, you know, often the lynch mob. And let me just say, by the way, some of you may, in the political theorists and political science department, I'm blanking now, but my way of thinking about that came out of, you know, thinking about the distinct, I have it in the footnote, but so I apologize for getting the students. Oh, I know. Coates was the last name. And this student was a student in a seminar I taught on Du Bois, and in the context of discussing Darkwater, alerted me in the paper that they wrote to the distinction between the mob and the crowd, and I do acknowledge it in the book, but I hadn't seen that before, and it helped me understand a lot that was going on in the book. So anyway, yeah, close parenthesis. The idea is that aesthetic education is geared to promoting, as it were, a democratic culture, which Du Bois associates with the figure, with the idea of the crowd. And the thought here, I mean, it's very interesting because I think Du Bois, as I read Du Bois, he thinks that the project of America writ large is, he says, at some point, I was going to try to find the passage, but he suggests that, you know, America kind of brings the category of the crowd, you know, into the world, and the suggestion is that it's failed in realizing that the realization of the category of the crowd, and obviously, people like John McCormack know that there's a whole German literature about crowds and masses and so forth and so on, and Du Bois is, but Du Bois is really, when Du Bois is using the category of the crowd, he's not using it, in the way that we associate more with the category of the mob or something like that. He's really, and so some people say, well, but crowds, blah, blah, blah. So he's got a distinctive conception of the crowd, what you might think of late 19th century, early 20th century kind of literature about the category of the crowd. Sometimes some of the problem here comes with the German translations, which kind of, with the translations from the German into English, which kind of confuse things. But long story short, did you find the passage?
Did you want the passage?
Yeah. Maybe I'll just read the relevant passage. Thank you. Long story short, Du Bois has a very, normatively, positive, anti-fascistic, let's say, conception of the crowd. Yes, the meaning of America is the beginning of the discovery of the crowd. The crowd is not so well trained as a Versailles garden party of Louis XIV, but it is far better trained than the sans-culotte, and it has infinite possibilities. What a world this will be when human possibilities are free, when we discover each other, when the stranger is no longer the potential criminal and the certain inferior. So thank you. So, and once you see how he's using this term, I mean, it crops up all over the place. There is something kind of going on of I think, interest to Du Bois scholars and perhaps, of interest, to those who think about democracy in terms of not just political procedures and so forth, but in terms of the idea of something that we might call a democratic culture. Adom also, I thought what you said about the expressivism and the way in which the expressivism might enter into be at work in Du Bois's typologies and the pageant and so forth and so on. I think that might be right, but I take it that and it would resonate with maybe the discussion in the shadow of Du Bois, the way in which certain certain kinds of leaders could be understood as embodying a certain as somehow in their persons expressing a kind of shared collective ethos. My worry, having and that may be at work in this long discussion of Black women in the damnation of women category chapter. Excuse me. But my worry about that chapter is that it involves and this is what I argue, and there's some hints in the direction of that of this argument, although not quite developed in the way that I do in some of Farrah Griffin's work, for example. But the basic idea is that Du Bois damns with faint praise, you might call it, or what's going on is what Stanley Cavell calls kind of false praise. In other words, women are depicted. There is kind of idealization of Black women that turns them into idols, and so I argue that representation of Black women that turns them into idols, and it's kind of very interesting because Du Bois is very echoing, I think, Mary Wollstonecraft, is kind of echoing a certain in passages where his language echoes Wollstonecraft. He talks about the representation of white women as idols, as setting them on a pedestal. But I think that when all said and done, Du Bois kind of does the same thing with Black women, and the problem is that you can't do that, and at the same time engage with Black women as fellow citizens. That to engage with someone as fellow citizen is to be open to the possibility that you might learn something from them. And Du Bois, if you set someone on a pedestal, you have a kind of fixed, determinate conception of who they are and what they have to offer. Even if it's positive, it's still a fixed and determinate conception of who they are and what they offer, and so there's no possibility of engaging them as fellow citizens. And that's not an external critique, that's an immanent critique, because, I think that built into Du Bois's conception of the crowd is this idea of openness to difference, even as it shows itself in the voices of your fellow citizens. But I think that's consistent with, just to finish that thought, consistent with the idea that maybe in these pageants something else is going on that again echoes the expressivism of the earlier work. I'm not sure what I think about the issue of ideals and hypocrisy. I guess I'll limit myself just to one thought. I do think, and of course, I'm sure that, yes, there are lots of places where Du Bois, says you're being a hypocrite, whatever. But and you cited a couple of passages, so I don't want to deny that those passages exist in Du Bois. It does strike me, though, that in Darkwater is suffused with Christian imagery and reflection on Christianity. This idea of this kind of syncretic new religion that involves both white supremacists and conventionally Christian elements. And so that means, I think, at least at this point, I think I argue that he worries that the charge of inconsistency is not sufficient. That what's at issue is, what in the book I call kind of metaphysical question. That is to say, the question: what is Christianity? What does Christianity commit us to? And the thought and the worry is that the persons who personify the kind of Christianity, the white supremacist, Christianity that he wants to criticize, the worry is that those persons just have a wrong, they've gotten it wrong, and so the role of art may be to challenge that self-understanding. And I have a kind of detailed discussion of a chapter of Darkwater, for those of you who know the text, called Jesus Christ in Texas, in which I try to, show how, against the backdrop of Du Bois's conception of beauty, this might work. One of the peculiar features of that chapter is that the artist turns out to be, in the fiction, Jesus Christ, himself. And so that then raises the question as to whether or not Du Bois's aesthetic, is only going to work with, religious art where the artist, is God himself and, conveys, at least in the eye of the beholder. And I try to make the case I try to argue that is not the case. In other words, that there are other, there's reason to believe that, divine authority is not a necessary condition of, having a work of art have that kind of, impact. And that's not, I suggest there, of course, in different philosophical traditions, I've talked about Iris Murdoch a bit, I talked a little bit about Gadamer. I mean, the point is that there is a way of thinking about the work of art and a beauty as Du Bois thinks about it, as possibly having kind of transformative impact on the audience. In the backdrop here, I won't go into this later. Maybe in the Q&A question if it's relevant. But this is only going to make sense against the backdrop of kind of moral psychology of the audience. And I talk about that both with respect to natural beauty and with respect to, in great detail in respect to the artistic beauty. In other words, the idea that, something like a dialogical engagement with the work of art, where the work of art is speaking to me is going to, that might transform me, requires that you think about, me, the person being transformed, as it were, not only from a kind of the standpoint of a kind of third person moral psychology, but it's kind of, a second person, or how to put it, first person moral psychology, where I can be addressed. And in the backdrop of those philosophers, in the room who might be familiar with the literature, is some of Tamar Shapiro's work, and what she has to say about having a guiding conception that orients one's actions. I think maybe I could make a transition now to, this might not be a bad time to, make a transition to an overlap kind of between issues that Adrienne raised and issues that Adom raised, having to do with Du Bois's conception of beauty, right? So there's a long passage at the end of the chapter entitled The Beauty of Death, where Du Bois says, this is the nature of beauty. I mean, I wrote a book that's, the print's kind of large, but, it's over 200 pages. But a lot of the book focuses, is just about, of beauty and death. And I keep coming, and I talk about other parts of Darkwater too. But there's this long passage where Du Bois says, this is the nature of beauty. So, I read it and reread it, like philosophers do when you come, you have a difficult passage written by a difficult philosopher, and you like read it and reread it, and I have a whole chapter, right, in the book interpreting that one paragraph, right, interpreting and trying to make sense of Du Bois' conception of beauty. So it's in that context that Bois is an aesthetician. I mean, he is offering, he's articulating and developing an account of the nature of beauty. The point that Adom, so it's in that connection, I think it makes sense to see him as an aesthetician. I think Adom's point about, cities, I think I kind of noticed that when I was reading, and I said, what do I want to say that? And I didn't come up with an answer, so I just kind of moved on. I operated with the kind of conventional Kantian distinction between natural beauty, artistic beauty, and human beauty. And what I was talking about, and I had to, and I should say that human beauty is actually very important to Du Bois. That and this didn't come out in either of your comments, but for Du Bois, the paradigm conception of a beautiful event is a beautiful life, a beautiful life as a beautiful event, and that's relevant to something that Jennifer and I were talking about before the session began. Du Bois suggests that a work of art, that to count as beautiful, a work of art has to be at once complete, have a kind of, integrity about it, and that's something, So to the extent that he's thinking in that ways, European aesthetics from Baumgarten to Kant, certain conception of beauty, whether we're talking about natural beauty or the beauty of work of art, is as something whole, as something complete, as something that has kind of coherence. That's not new. It's part of, and it enters into these early modern, theories of aesthetic judgment. But Du Bois also has this kind of Gadammerian, Murdochian, and for Gadamer, of course, Heidegger's in the background, this kind of critique of this kind of subject-centered aesthetic that, Gadamer has introduced yesterday, where he talks about the movement, thinking about, aesthetic judgment, to think about what he calls the experience of the work of art. And I think that both of those are going on, something like both of those are going on in Du Bois's concept of beauty, whether we're talking about natural beauty or artistic beauty. That on the one hand, a beautiful life, it's got this, yes, this comes down to the question of temporality. It's got this, I think what I call a kind of bipolar temporality. So on the one hand, to the extent that a work of art, as it were, comes to an end, achieves a kind of coherence, it invites a kind of backward-looking, judgment. That is to say, we can kind of see what it is as a whole, as a complete whole, but at the same time, it points beyond itself to new possibilities. So completeness, as well as the revelation of new possibilities, are part of what's going on. Is completeness, how seriously should we take the completeness, idea? Many people who've kind of, I've engaged with, in conversation about that, have expressed skepticism, especially when it's applied to a human life. Does a human life have to have a kind of coherence such that when we kind of look at it retrospectively, we can see that it has a wholeness, a completeness, kind of coherence? I think the skepticism is warranted, but I think that what needs to be kept in mind is I think Du Bois's, broadly speaking, Du Bois's Calvinism. That is to say, I think Du Bois, when you read that, the relevant passage in Darkwater, where he explains the concept of beauty, he represents, the general picture is a picture of human beings born in he doesn't use the word sin, but born into ugliness, and tasked with, and such that their lives, one's life is, you're born into ugliness, and you're kind of tasked with, the end of your life, your reason for being, is to overcome that ugliness, and you overcome that ugliness by making of your life something whole and complete. Now, obviously, that aspect of it is not Calvinist, but this idea of being born into sin and then being tasked with the project of redeeming your life by making something whole and complete of your life, I think that's what's going on, and it is a very high bar. Right, and even maybe that's also Calvinist too. It's a very high bar. I mean, how many of us are among the elect? Right? I mean, we don't know. We hope that but it's a very high bar, and how one thinks about that, endorses it, or so forth and so on. I don't think it's possible to have that conversation, without taking into account its what I argue is its religious roots. I guess on the last point, and I'll then shut up. Form, the rearrangement of form, new form. I'm not sure that I'm completely following you. I mean, so I have two thoughts. I've been reading Paul Taylor's book that I'm teaching next week, called "Black is Beautiful." Philosophy of Black aesthetics, or something like that. And he begins the chapter by talking about, invoking Stuart Hall and talking about it simply. And I was thinking a little bit about that, because the way you were talking about arrangement, rearrangement seemed to me, this is an essay that, Hall wrote about, the 1980s, and, there's a kind of, historical kind of cultural shift that, he thinks, he associates with Thatcher and what's happening, in terms of Black culture, productivity, but this idea of simile seemed to me to connect with the notion of arrangement, rearrangement. So that's just one thought, and that's just because I happen to be reading things and they connected. So, but the other thing is the way you're talking about it was interesting. You were saying that there's a synthesis of arrangement, rearrangement, the production of form, but not necessarily of new form. Yeah. And I think that that's probably right. I have to think more about it, but I guess what I would want to highlight is that I think both things are there, and this goes back to what I was saying. Maybe trying to say regarding his conception of beauty. In other words, there is this formalism, Baumgarten, Kant, so to speak, formalism about the conception of about his conception. But I think that's right. One might strive to arrange one's life in a certain way that it comes out, as whole and complete. But, thinking about the paradigm of the beautiful life. But at the same time, I think he thinks that from the standpoint of someone who bears witness to that life, that if it's a genuinely beautiful life, we will find in it the revelation of new possibilities, and so the new, and the old in some sense go together, but the new is not necessarily related to form, so it's complicated. And I guess the last point for those of you who have some familiarity with, the history of modern aesthetics, I think that this tension, it's not, again, and maybe this is responsive to the conversation that Jennifer and I were having. There's a way, for example, with someone like Gadamer, when he's talking about, moving, when he's trying to move beyond a strictly Kantian aesthetic, and thinking about, or Kant's concept of beautiful, let me be precise, Kant's thinking about the beautiful as an object of aesthetic judgment, and he's moving to thinking about the experience of the work of art. That in other essays, I'm not sure if in that essay, but in other essays, it's pretty clear that the historical background consideration, that what he's trying that he associates Kant's conception of the sublime, specifically the dynamical sublime, with this more revelatory, conception of the power of the work of art. And I mention that because, and the reason it's relevant to the conversation you and I were having is that there's a way in which Du Bois's conception of beauty involves, I think, elements that are conventionally associated, with early modern European conception of beauty, but also with, early modern conceptions of the sublime, and he kind of puts them together in a kind of in an interesting way. And I guess one last point, and this is really important, that I really will stop, is that Du Bois, at the beginning of Darkwater, Darkwater begins with a postscript, paradoxically begins with a postscript, and postscript, and Du Bois says, everything I'm saying from the point of view of a veiled corner. So I argue that Du Bois's aesthetic is aesthetic, undertaken from the veiled corner. He's not trying to give, individually necessary, jointly sufficient conditions of, what beauty, of the proper application, of the term beauty. Rather, he is asking himself, what is beauty? What can I say about beauty? From the standpoint of the veiled corner. And what's salient from the standpoint of the veiled corner is what beauty does in the way of constraining and limiting the scope of ugliness, right, in the world. And both beauty and ugly, both terms, have moral, connotations for Du Bois. So limiting the scope of ugliness is also limiting the scope of evil. And so what he's focusing on are features of, in his account of the nature of beauty, I agree that what he's focusing on are features of the beauty that from the standpoint of the veiled corner, we can, from a distinctly black perspective, in other words, come into view as limiting and constraining the scope of ugliness. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. So we have just about half an hour for questions. I would like to ask you to wait until you have the microphone in hand for purposes of recording. I know we may be able to hear you within the room. So the floor is open. Oh, I can't see. Okay, yeah, please.
Hi, thank you so much. That was wonderful. I just have a question about when you talked about the completeness of life is beautiful, and then also you were talking about how, like, in this complete life, the possibilities that are embedded within the life is also beautiful in a sense. Like, I just want to maybe have you clarify on that what it means to have possibilities in a complete life.
So the thought is just that so it's not that the possibilities themselves are beautiful. It's rather that beauty involves these two dimensions. On the one hand, it invites contemplation and contemplation, and it's because there's a temporal dimension. This kind of contemplation has kind of retrospective dimension to it. So grasping, the event that has come to an end as whole and complete. But on the other hand, appreciating it as beautiful involves seeing in it the disclosure of new possibilities heretofore, and that's going to be kind of mind dependent. I mean, this is not something I really explore, but what will come into view for you as a new possibility may not come into view for me as a new possibility. But it was interesting. There's a philosopher, famous Anglo-American analytic philosopher named Keith Lehrer, who's written about these issues, and I talked a bit about Lehrer's work. I mean, there are affinities between Lehrer and Du Bois, not only with respect to art, but also with respect to beautiful lives. And I spent some time talking about his discussion of the death of his friend Gloria. And anyway, in that connection, it's worth he's somewhere he says after you've seen what does a Van Gogh painting of sunflowers do for you? Well, you see sunflowers in a new light, right? And I suggest that there might be an analogy that Du Bois is that the part of seeing a life as beautiful is see something new as emerging from that life. But these are aspects of beauty. Not the idea is not the possibilities of beauty. That the forward, it's not that the forward-looking dimension of beauty is beautiful. The point is that beauty involves both the backward and forward-looking dimension, and the forward-looking dimension involves possibility. But But that's different than saying that the possibilities themselves are somehow beautiful. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Bob, for that, and thanks for the discussion. I wanted to go back, because I feel like I didn't get clear on your response to Adom's question about the relationship between, you see, between dark water and souls, in terms of
Yeah.
its continuity, whether it's
Good.
dark
Thank you.
water marks are significant. And you don't have to answer it necessarily in the terms she set out, which was, folk mass to crowd mob.
Right.
But whether or not something is significantly different, and sort of put pressure a certain way, right? It feels to me that in that on death and duty piece, right, that one of the driving things is just when he says the veil, he means Jim Crow.
Uh-huh.
He means segregation that
Yes.
hangs over
Yes.
the sort of the travel log
Right.
to these sort of sublime spaces, right? Like those things are beautiful, but you can't to get there. You get Jim Crow'd, and that is the ugliness that is always attended for the
Yes.
black viewer in terms of beauty.
Right.
And on that account, right, he seems to be returning to the commitment to the idea of the veil as Jim Crow, that which separates black from white,
Yes.
on invidious and insupportable grounds,
Yes.
such that it really is that's the problem that he's interested in. Less so. I mean, if you started to push back strongly to say less so than in sort of philosophically rigorous accounts of what beauty happened to be. It's more like you can't get to the beauty in the way that you want to because Jim Crow keeps standing in the way, whether it's sublime or whether you can define it one way or another. The real problem is Jim Crow. So
Yeah.
that may be wrong, but I guess really the question is, would you, whether on my terms or on Adom's term, make clear where you see the relationship between souls and dark water, more in terms of continuity or discontinuity.
Yeah. So I don't know how I want to quantify it in terms of more or less, but so I'll probably resist that. But maybe let me talk about some continuities and discontinuities in particular. I think that the way Adom raised the question, she raised it in terms of democracy, and I think that normatively Du Bois is, committed to democracy. In souls, he's committed. As it were, what we're after. What the telos of political struggle is. That's not to say that his conception of that. On the other hand, I think that his conception of how we get there, as it were, has this talented vanguard leadership kind of dimension throughout. I think Adolf, for example, is absolutely right about that. I mean, he cites lots of evidence to suggest that. I also think there's a lot of going on aesthetically of interest in souls of black folk. This is something we didn't talk about, but and this is a point of continuity. Connect art in relation to pessimism. In Shadow of Du Bois, I argue that the sorrow songs function as a kind of counterpoint to the pessimism, and that is evoked at the end of the chapter entitled, of the coming of John. In that connection, I make the argument that Du Bois is more or less portraying John as he's about to be lynched. I mean, as you might guess, people disagree with this reading, but still, it's my reading, and I think he comes into view as kind of Schopenhauerian pessimist. I think art comes into view as a kind of counterpoint to pessimism. I think that's going on, in Dark Water as well. And in that connection, I have some things to say about about Du Bois's pessimism in relationship to contemporary Afro-pessimism. I have a kind of critique of Wooderson in the last chapter of the book. But coming to all of this from the standpoint of someone who spent a lot of time of his life reading Schopenhauer and Nietzsche, I think that there's a lot going on in Du Bois that resonates with Nietzsche's engagement with Schopenhauer and Schopenhauer's pessimism, the way in which the aesthetic art and so forth and so on is responsive to pessimism. Now, coming back to coming out of Ken's question. Yeah, no, I actually don't think that it's all about Jim Crow. I think certainly Jim Crow is part of it. I think, that there's a much larger international, horizon animating the argument of dark water. This essay that we were talking about a few minutes ago, African Roots of War, 1915. I think that actually thinking about the Berlin Conference, the 1880s, was 1885, with the European powers. I mean, the Souls of White Folk is an incredible, other chapters too, where Du Bois is explaining, World War I, in terms of European imperialism. I think that the European imperialism is as important, if not more important, to Jim Crow. And thinking about what Du Bois is doing, I mean, actually, one of the questions I raise is why would, if you think art is important vis-a-vis, or beauty is important vis-a-vis, some kind of progressive, political project, you have to have a kind of understanding of the role the culture plays in all of that. And I in the chapter on democratic despotism, I have a detailed account of how I think that works. And although I don't argue, I don't make the case that Du Bois is influenced by Weber on this point, but Weber has this famous discussion of the way in which you have, to simplify somewhat, you have material interests and then worldviews, function as switches that determine, how those material interests play out. And I think something like that is going on at the level of causal explanation, a kind of counterfactualist causal explanation. And I mention that, Ken, because in that chapter I try to discuss the way in which that is operating not only against the backdrop of World War I and European imperialism, but also about the way in which that is operating in Du Bois's analysis of East St. Louis. And again, what Du Bois is thinking about there is, he's thinking Jim Crow, but what Du Bois is thinking about there is again this idea of a labor aristocracy and the way in which the white working class in East St. Louis manipulates racism to, as it were, cover up its own alliance with capital. So there's a much more materialist, analysis. I would, that again resonates, with, this notion of a labor aristocracy. Du Bois is using it before it comes out in Lenin. So, there's an antecedent in Engels, and maybe that's where he got it. But it is quite striking that notion is at work in Du Bois. And on the last point, I guess I'd say that, you read that he has an account of the nature of beauty. So I don't want to kind of say, oh, well, he's just doing this. He's just worried about, I think he's really trying to think hard about these things. When he says that, if you're looking at the, this moment where he's, someone mentioned the Chaplin moment, he's having his conversations with these friends and they don't, his worry is that they don't travel enough. Yeah, there's Jim Crow, but Jim Crow is kind of the least of all. I mean, the least of the slights, and he says these black people need to travel more and expose themselves to natural beauty. And if they did, their sense of things would be different. How philosophically that's supposed to work is kind of complicated and perhaps, for most people intuitively the least persuasive, but he's got this view of it. I think there are passages where he's saying where he's making profound, he's not just kind of, throwing I guess I don't, read these comments as just, throw-offs. I think he's actually making claims. Now, you might say, yeah, but Bob, professionally you're committed to like taking stuff like that and then producing like books, but maybe, so you gotta, it's kind of constitutive of the project, is taking some passage and saying, well, this is like really significant. Let me now write 100 pages to tell you why. You might, and I guess I have to plead guilty to that.
Because a quick follow-up on
that,
because I do take your point, is that, it is clear to me, right, that you say the color line, Jim Crow color line, same thing. he has a world view of color line,
Right.
going back to souls and all the way through his contribution to the New Negro.
Yes.
He comes back and says, yeah, the color line remains the
Right.
problem of the 20th century.
Right.
And he means Jim Crow, and he means it expansively. And yeah, he's a, so I'm not saying it's reductive to talk about
Right.
Jim Crow in the way that he talks about it, right? But
Right.
it is the overarching structure, it seems to me, of what he's engaged with from souls through Dark Order. You know,
The only thing I'd
there's
add to
not
that
much
is that
to,
he's not, I don't see him in Souls as trying to think through the relationship between capitalist self-interest and Jim Crow. And I think that is going on in Dark Water.
Yeah, I think he's there too, but
In Souls too, yeah, okay,
In Souls,
okay,
to
yeah,
a
maybe,
certain
okay, fair enough.
extent. But the other thing about I don't mean he's throwing away, I mean, that aesthetics is a throwaway for him.
Yeah, okay,
I just say he's not consistent in it and how he uses it necessarily.
that may be true.
Because there's a kind of broader aesthetic question that
Right.
Darkwater constitutes. He says, I've got these flights of fancy, I've got these analytical things. I think they go together,
Yes,
right? But he doesn't lay out the blueprint for exactly how they're going together. So he's thinking aesthetically, and maybe then you've got this point where he's sort of
Yeah.
trying to work it through. Does it work through as a way of accounting for the overall method that he's employing in the book? I don't know. I mean,
I have a reading of those
Yeah.
passages, tries to like make it all work, but you could, maybe he would, yeah.
okay.
Like no, I think that's right. I mean, I think the question is, how do they, I think it's a really hard question as to whether or not, how to think about those passages, but it's a longer conversation.
Yeah,
Okay,
thanks.
good, yeah.
This was excellent. I'm very excited to pick up a copy of the book when I leave. I wanted to ask about something you said. It seems like a very important argument of the book that Du Bois' notion of beauty commits him to a democratic pluralism because beauty opens us up to something new, which is like a precursor to pluralism. But I wanted to ask what you think about that in the light of the use of beauty often to kind of foreclose the possibilities of democracy.
Yeah.
I'm thinking specifically in the way in which, like, white supremacist movements, the Nazis, maybe contemporary thinkers sort of mobilize beauty as a thing that must be defended from sort of the hordes that are undermining it. How those things work together for both you and for Du Bois is my question.
Yeah. So look, I don't know. On the way over here, on the flight, and then I think some this morning I was listening to this podcast. I guess when I was like on my stationary, but I finished it with Masha Gessen and Ezra Klein about Venezuela and Renee Good and so forth, and this issue came up of Trump and the spectacle, distraction, kind of driven kind of spectacle that kind of constitutes Trump's politics. In this connection, they were talking about beauty, and the way in which the aesthetic, generally beauty, particularly, was kind of appropriated by the right. What about the left? Blah blah. And, Ezra Klein has a book at home on Nazi aesthetics and so forth and so on. But now, what I was thinking about in this connection, so I think, look, that's all there, and that's so. How to think about Du Bois in connection to that? I think that Du Bois is probably thinking about the aesthetic in a somewhat different way. That's why it's really important, I think, to see that Du Bois is not just, armchair kind of thinking about, that he's looking at it from the standpoint of the corner, that he's thinking about beauty in ways that, so he's not operating in terms of the kind of separation of spheres that, after Kant, modern, it's not like we have, moral philosophy. It's that, it's not like we have, knowledge, first critique, moral philosophy, the groundwork of the second critique, and then aesthetics. He's all these categories, and this is, are the aesthetic and normative categories are all getting kind of planned. And again, beauty is something real in the world. Okay, I don't know, when I was listening to the podcast, I was surprised that they didn't talk about Benjamin, because I thought it was interesting that. I thought the obvious one thing you might say is that in terms of the contemporary moment, these spectacles are, what does Benjamin say in the essay on the mechanical reproduction of the work of art? That, basically, when fascism aestheticizes politics, it provides people occasions to, as it were, express themselves rather than challenge property relations. And you can see something like that, I think, in the contemporary moment. That's what I would have said if, I didn't, permanent podcast, but I was on my bike just listening. But I think that someone like Du Bois could embrace something like that view, and it would be consistent with what he has to say. So how could that be? Well, because he's using the category of beauty in a kind of different, uh, register. I mean, does that mean that somehow we have to philosophically solve the problem by figuring out which is the right conception of beauty? Not necessarily. I think it's more important to understand, how these categories are kind of working in what particular context and what someone like Du Bois is doing with them. I mean, different people are operating against the backdrop of a larger received, intellectual traditions doing different things. But I would be wary to say, well, this is the right or this is the wrong. I mean, I would want a thicker, more historically contextualized way of thinking about these things.
If you just wait for the mic.
There seems to be a prescriptive theme in your treatment. It's not simply, excuse my voice, it's hoarse. It's not simply a description of democracy and beauty.
Yeah.
But beauty is supposedly doing a work.
Yes.
That is to say that to militate against white supremacy. Now, beauty is a rather expensive concept.
Yes.
And is rather vague.
Yeah.
How do you think, or how can you answer that Du Bois is suggesting how that can be operationalized?
Yeah, well, so the book is in some sense an attempt to answer that question. And as I said, in the backdrop is associated with kind of like white Christian culture as a kind of, moral psychology of the white supremacist Christian, and a certain understanding of the way in which, a work of art could challenge, that person's self-understanding. I don't take Du Bois to be saying that beauty, I was talking in another context, talking about the book, and someone said, I guess it was at the APA, someone said that Bob thinks that Du Bois thinks that beauty is like the core thing that we need to do to, fight against capitalism, white supremacy. So I don't think Du Bois thinks that at all. I mean, I think it's just one thing, and as Adom was, it's important, I think, in part to think about Du Bois as an experimental writer. So I actually think, so first, just to answer your question very directly, I do think, yes, it's vague, but I think that Du Bois, the book is an attempt to say, is to kind of, the devil's in the details. So the book is, as it were, an attempt to bring out the details and to show, in some sense, how this is supposed to work. Some of it's more persuasive than others, but what I'm trying to do ambitiously, I suppose, is to say, look, you've got this book and these writings, mainly Darkwater, where there's an account of beauty and then lots of talk about beauty in various contexts. Is there a way of pulling all this together and saying, this is the theory of beauty that's operative, and we can see how it explains or makes sense of these passages where he's talking. So that's the ambition. But I also think that, it's important to see that Du Bois is an experimental writer. As Adom was saying, at this point in his career, he's thinking, well, just doing science is not going to help, pointing out logical contradictions, and that's not going to help me. That with some people, maybe, but with some people, it's not gonna work. And he's developed a very moralized, But as Jennifer pointed out to me in an earlier conversation, the tripartite periodization is slightly problematic. I actually argue that. I mean, I think that's there, but I actually think that Darkwater kind of, has one leg in the second and one leg in the third. I mean, there's a way in which it, So later, Du Bois is reading Freud, and he's talking about the unconscious, and so Du Bois thinks there's, propaganda and sometimes immediate assault, sometimes what he calls long siege. The struggle, has lots of different dimensions, and it's interesting if you get to Dusk of Dawn, where he's already, moved to where he's clearly talking about the long siege, and he's thinking not only in Marxist terms but also psychoanalytic terms. It's interesting that when he's talking about these earlier moments, he himself really, that's where the ill will stuff. It's a very more in Darkwater. The perspective is very moralistic, and I think that's really important. And I think that's why the moral psychology, whether you're talking about the moral psychology, cowardness as a, reaction to Jim Crow, or he's talking about the, more psychology of the white supremacists. These are all, these are salient aspects of the larger argument.
As a last question to you specifically, as a analytic philosopher, if you were to offer a critique of Du Bois, would you say that Du Bois' ramification of the concept of beauty,
Reification?
ramify?
Oh, ramification. Oh, yeah,
Because
sorry.
this is beauty.
Yes, right.
And sometimes you say it is, and I don't know what
Yeah.
part of the aesthetics
Right.
that is being named.
Right, right.
To what extent could it be a category mistake?
A category mistake. And where, so like a category mistake is sort of, you don't mean in the technical, like saying the number 2 is blue? Philosophers,
No,
that would be an example of it.
I mean in the sense that, for example, even the pairing of democracy and beauty
Right.
could itself be
Oh.
category mistake.
Got it. I
It's
see.
to say that the
Got it.
confusion of categories that have nothing to do with one another.
Yeah.
They are appended together.
I think that question makes sense if you're coming to, one might think that if one just, is operating with some kind of preconception of a certain preconception of beauty. I think what's interesting is to see what Du Bois does with the category of beauty. I mean, it's not just the Du Bois saying, oh, I just think beauty can do all this stuff. I mean, he tries to develop a way of thinking about beauty, for better or worse, whether it works or not, natural and artistic and human. That and it's doing work for him if you think it through. Whether he succeeds is another question. But I don't think it's just bringing together things that don't belong together in an obvious way. Yeah.
That brings us to time. So thank you. Please join me in thanking Bob.
Thank you all.